You're listening to the Volhard Pack Podcast, your go-to for holistic dog health, natural nutrition, and whole body wellness. Together, we're redefining what it means for our dogs to thrive naturally. Welcome to the pack. Today's episode is for all our wellness nerds, nature lovers, and anyone who's ever wondered, can mushrooms really help my dog? Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. We're joined by the brilliant Dr. Rob Silver, a pioneer in integrative veterinary medicine and the author of the newly released book, There's a Mushroom for That. In this episode, we dive into everything from reishi and longevity to anxiety support through microdosing to the deep biological connection between humans, dogs, and fungi. Dr. Rob shares insights from his extensive career, how he went from relief work to developing herbal formulas, the science behind medicinal mushrooms, and why every dog can benefit from these powerful natural allies. We also bust some common mushroom myths and talk about how to safely add mushrooms to your dog's routine. So whether you're already sprinkling mushrooms into your pup's bowl or you're just mushroom curious, this episode is full of wisdom, inspiration, and a whole lot of geeky goodness. Let's get into it.
Thank you for joining us. So let's start at the beginning. How did your journey into veterinary medicine begin, and what pulled you toward mushrooms and integrative care?
Well, as many veterinarians, I've always, had a love for animals and maybe a special kind of connection to them as well. And I've always been kind of a scientific, nerdy sort of a guy as well. And, so it kind of blended together. The folks wanted me to be a doctor, human doctor, and I just didn't resonate with that, but I did resonate with the idea of being a veterinarian. I wasn't sure, I grew up in the 60s and there was a lot of disruption there, a lot of different choices available that weren't necessarily career oriented. But we're Jewish, and my folks had the whole family go on a trip to Israel, and I'd never really thought much about it. But when I was there, and this was a long time ago, not the current situation. When I was there was just something about it that really caught my interest. And so I stayed for a year. And I worked on one of the collective farms, and I worked with a French veterinarian in the chickens and dairy. And it really got me going. So, when that was done, I came back to the States and tried to recover my college career, because I was my freshman year at college, I was at Columbia where the students had taken over. So I kind of tuned in, turned on, dropped out, and sort of, did that thing, and so then when it came time to go back to school, some of those bad grades followed me. So it took me a while to finally get into vet school. In the meantime, I got a research degree in physiology, cardiopulmonary physiology. So I graduated from vet school quite a while ago in 1982. And when I graduated, I thought that I knew everything about treating sick animals. And, after, a little time in practice, I realized that there's some conditions that pets have that don't really respond very well to the the medications or the techniques or the procedures that we had learned. And when I graduated at the depth of a recession back in 82, the early 80s. So I wasn't able to find a regular job. Instead, what I did was part-time was fill-in work at different veterinarians who wanted to take a day off. They call that relief work. And that actually wound up being a good thing, because I got to see how different veterinarians did the same thing, because everyone has their kind of own way of doing it. So it allowed me to kind of choose the techniques and procedures and approaches that made sense to me after seeing how a couple of different vets would do it.
That's such a turning point. When did herbs and food begin to feel like part of the solution?
So I started looking for some other answers, because the conventional stuff wasn't enough. I've always had an interest in plants and herbs. I'm a big backpacker and survivalist. And so I learned how to identify plants, in terms of wild foraging. And in vet school, one of my favorite classes was poisonous plants, where you go outside and you identify plants. And so I joined the Rocky Mountain or the Pikes Peak Herb Association and a bunch of herbalists, and learned how to identify plants and how to make plant medicines. And so I started a little bit doing that. I got a book by Richard Pitcairn 1982 edition of Natural Health for Dogs and Cats, which had some recipes in it. I started offering recipes because not only was I looking for answers, but I was also getting driven by clients who wanted me to do holistic work. And at the time, I really wasn't quite certain what that was. It sounded good. So I started looking at herbs, I started looking at diet, and I found that even with just simple changes to a diet that nutrient profiles we don't really agree with anymore, I still was seeing good results for cases that weren't really responding to the medications, just changing diet. That was the eye opener for me. That something simple like changing the food they're eating could make such a difference. And then looking at herbs as food, looking at herbs as biological modifiers, and so that was kind of where I got started, and then the rest is just sort of history. What, After about 10 years of my career, I got approached because I was writing and talking to other vets about my successes with these different modalities. And I finally was able to afford to take the acupuncture course and all that stuff. So I was approached by a company called RX Vitamins that asked me if I could formulate products for veterinarians to use that were, supplements. And so I started doing that about 30 years ago. And I formulated 40 products that are still in use by this company, RX Vitamins. They were sold in the depths of the pandemic and let me go because that's kind of how corporate things work, as we're seeing these days too, corporate greed. And so at that point, when I left RX Vitamins, I spent quite a bit of time teaching veterinarians about the value of integrative medicine. I introduced the concept of leaky gut to veterinarians. I introduced a lot of these concepts, and I had a lot of products that I created that addressed these concepts. I hadn't really had as much contact with the pet space, the pet parent space, except as clients. And during the pandemic, I wasn't really aware of how things had changed during the pet space when everyone was shut inside and started doing their online things, and it kind of felt a little left out. But anyway, when I lost the position at RX Vitamins, I had made a mushroom formula for them, and mushrooms have always been a great interest of mine. And so I reached out to the company where I had gotten the raw materials for the mushroom formula for RX Vitamins, because I had identified them as being one of the tops of the world. And I reached out to them to say, hey, I'm free now. Would you like me to develop a line of products for pets for your company? Because they've been just doing human products for the last 8 years. And this company is Real Mushrooms. They're a Canadian company, and they've been cultivating about 12 different mushroom species under USDA organic standards for 40 years. And so one of the global leaders and one of the experts. And when I work with a company, I'd like to align myself with someone who has that kind of, standing, in terms of their reputation, and also just in terms of the quality of the work. So that's kind of where it started, this interest in, I've had this interest in mushrooms for a long time because I've been looking at a lot of different natural products that can enhance health in one way or another. And mushrooms are high on the list, along with herbs and certainly, with diet, that sort of thing. So I've been with Real Mushrooms now for 3 or 4 years. I guess I joined in 2021, really, and we started working with them right away. Didn't really get a contract together until the next year. And we've got some products that are good products, some that are just, single species mushrooms, some are the mushroom blends, and then some that are blends of mushrooms with herbs and other nutraceuticals to create a specific kind of outcome. And we're seeing good results with these herbs and with these mushrooms. I had a great interest in cannabis back in 2015 when cannabis got to be more legal, shall we say. It's still not really quite legal. And I had developed an expertise in that area and had introduced CBD to this company, RX Vitamins. They doubled their income. And I spoke extensively to veterinarians who were quite interested in it. So now I'm kind of switching that whole conversation to discuss and explain what is so special about mushrooms, because I see them in many ways as being comparable to cannabis in terms of the complexity of the organism, in terms of the number of different active ingredients that they have that provide multiple benefits, not just, a single benefit. And I see them both having comparable sets of similar ingredients, just one's mushroom version, one's plant version. Like for instance, one of the big things with cannabis are the terpenes. Terpenes are what give food, vegetables, plants their aroma. When you squeeze a lemon and you smell that smell, that's actually a terpene called limonene. And when and so a lot of people, they'll smell their cannabis, go, ooh, that smells pretty potent. Well, what they're really smelling are the terpenes, not the actual THC or anything like that. Well, mushrooms also have terpenes, and the terpenes are extremely potent, but they're much bigger terpenes. You can't smell them. Which also means they don't blow off when you cook the mushrooms. So they're part of the mushroom activity.
It just sounds like everything really happened in the way that it needed to happen. And I'm so glad that you're a part of Real Mushrooms because I actually stumbled upon them, I think it was back in 2017. So I'm originally from California, but I live in Pennsylvania now, and I'm in the mushroom mecca.
Western Pennsylvania?
So I'm actually in central Pennsylvania.
There's a lot of caves in that area, I think, that they're
Yes.
using to grow the mushrooms in. It's like the capital of the button mushrooms growth in the United States, isn't it?
It's so amazing because when I moved here, I noticed that so we have the eastern hemlock, but they are unfortunately being taken out by the woolly adelgisa. In that death, we're receiving reishi. So we have all of these Ganoderma species.
Really?
Yes, everywhere that are growing. The woods are just completely covered.
That reishi that you said you had earlier, you've been collecting it
Yeah.
in the wild? Yeah, and that reishi is very powerful. There's so many different species of reishi all over
Yeah.
the world.
Yes, it's so magical, and I love going and visiting my reishi trees.
I'd love to go for a walk with you someday.
Yeah, and just connecting. I would love to talk about reishi a little bit because I've noticed that a lot of people that reach out to us, they are familiar with medicinal mushrooms, but they're familiar with turkey tail, right? Because turkey tail has been studied a lot. When I stumbled upon reishi, I was actually still in college and I found a book by Dr. Terry Willard. So yeah, he wrote a book on reishi, and it's not in print anymore, but I found it at a thrift store and I was just blown away, and I thought, why isn't anyone talking about this mushroom in the United States? So yeah, I would love for you to touch on reishi a little bit.
Every mushroom is a book in itself, really. And that's one reason I just have published this book, by the way, called There's a Mushroom for That, which basically, has a section in it that's like an encyclopedia of 12 different mushrooms. We call it a materia medica. So it gives basic data about each of these 11 or 12, I keep forgetting how many there are in there. And then the book also has, stories about conditions that I've treated in pets using mushrooms and cannabis and conventional medicine and everything like that. Reishi, is considered to be the mushroom of the mortality. And it had the legend around reishi, is that it conveys long life. And now that we've done, scientific studies of all the ingredients that are in reishi, we understand why. Reishi has probably the highest number of these terpenes in them. And these terpenes in reishi are very large molecules. They call them triterpenes because they're so large. And if you've ever tasted reishi, and perhaps the reishi that you have growing there is maybe the terpenes aren't strong or are strong. That's part of what makes that taste. The terpenes taste very bitter.
Very bitter, yes.
Real mushrooms reishi, they do a dual extraction. They don't just extract the beta-glucans using a hot water bath, which is the classical way of doing it, but they also use ethanol to extract the terpenes or the triterpenes, which are alcohol soluble but not water soluble, which gives the reishi that Real Mushrooms produces having the highest percentage of triterpenes of any product on the market. So it's muy potente. And those triterpenes are in part responsible for the effects that reishi has in terms of calming. It's the terpenes in cannabis that interact with the membrane receptors that are serotonergic membrane receptors that produce that calming parasympathetic kind of response. Well, we have larger terpenes in the reishi. They still signal, the same receptors, creating that calmness. That's one reason reishi has been used for centuries by Zen masters and other, spiritual people as a meditation aid because it's very centering and very grounding. And I put reishi in my relaxed mushroom chew formula. I've got some chews that have reishi, and then I've got some. I got what? here, which have the reishi and lion's mane, a few other goodies as well to make it effective. Reishi, though, also these terpenes in reishi have antihistaminic properties, which is amazing. What they do is they'll stabilize mast cell membranes, similar to the same way that quercetin can do that as well. Although it's not an antihistamine in terms of the drug category of the molecule, it functions to reduce the release of histamine, so it reduces the symptoms. Plus, reishi being almost the perfect allergy medicine in that, and maybe using the word medicine is not something to make the FDA happy, but certainly a natural substance that can influence the health of an animal who has allergies would be a more FDA compliant statement. That's why, because it not only does it have the terpenes in it, but reishi also has beta-glucans, and these beta-glucans, will stimulate the immune system and help to balance the immune system. So we know with allergies, the immune system's out of whack. It's reacting to things that there's pollen is not something very life-threatening. Reishi, in that context, can help to balance the immune system and can help to reduce the release of histamine. Plus, reishi winds up being food, the polysaccharides, the beta-glucans, which are polysaccharides, and other polysaccharides in the reishi, like chitin. And then there's also alpha-glucan types of polysaccharides, as well as the beta-glucans. The alpha-glucans are digestible starch, whereas the beta-glucans aren't digestible starch. All of those feed the microbiome. And we know so much now about how the microbiome actually influences, immune activities such as allergies.
Yeah, and that concept is so exciting that mushrooms can help teach the immune system how to respond. It just makes so much sense to me when we look at chronic inflammation, we see allergies and even autoimmune trends in dogs that are happening right now.
So, it's not a magic cure. And I'm fond of telling people that mushrooms are really a lifestyle something. It's something that is best when it's given every day or nearly every day. I mean, you can take a break, over the weekend or something. It's oftentimes what I do. But, it's something that should be part of your lifestyle. And the longer you use them, the better they work. There's something that we've learned about the use of beta-glucans long term, that it actually trains the immune system. And what that means is, typically the mushrooms work on the innate immune system. And the innate immune system is kind of the primal immune system that single-celled organisms originally used to protect themselves from threats. And it doesn't generally have a memory of the pathogens and the antigens and the things that it reacts to. But what we've learned is that the beta-glucans have activity in the bone marrow with the stem cells, and that they actually, and we don't know how this works yet, but they actually modify the epigenetics of the immune stem cells to produce a longer standing memory of the pathogen or the antigen that they had contacted and reacted to. So it almost makes them like an acquired immune system. You almost wonder if maybe the primal eating of mushrooms by animals, once they learn which mushrooms not to eat, they have gradually, over a period of time, trained those early primal immune systems that were primarily innate to become more of these acquired immune systems that we now have that are very specific for specific pathogens. It's fascinating stuff. We are still in the infancy of learning about them,
Yeah, absolutely. It is so fascinating when you just spoke to the epigenetics portion of it because, like you said, there's so much that we don't know yet. And are we part mushroom, right? Are we sharing that?
Billions of years ago, there was a single-celled ancestor that split into the fungal kingdom and the animal kingdom. And for this reason, we believe we actually share 30% of our DNA with the fungal kingdom. And that may be why fungal pathogens are so toxic. It may also be why mushrooms and other fungi that aren't pathogenic are actually very beneficial. But there's another piece to this story, which is that early on, members of the animal kingdom had to learn to defend themselves against members of the fungal kingdom, because to begin with they were pathogenic, because you eat whatever's around, and if it means you're eating another living thing, then you're a pathogen, but you got to survive. The immune system, the growing immune system of animals, learned to detect a fungal pathogen by the shape because when that cell would contact the animal cell, there was a certain shape to the outside of that cell wall of the fungal cell. And that shape is defined by the shape of a beta-glucan. Because beta-glucans and chitin are primarily what make up that sturdy outer cell wall of the fungus. So the beta-glucans don't actually have a function. They're not like a drug. They're more like what we would call a biological response modifier, because what they do is they stimulate they aren't altered chemically, but they actually stimulate the immune system by virtue of their shape of the beta glucans being detected by that immune cell. And it turns out there's three different types of receptors that receive beta glucans on immune cells. There's actually five total, but there's three types. There's the toll-like receptors have three different types of receptors on them. So this is why when you eat a mushroom, which has the beta glucan as part of its cell wall, it will stimulate your immune system, because your immune system thinks that there's a pathogen coming when all it gets is the beta glucan of an edible mushroom. So that's one way that they work. And we know that beta glucans have a much wider range of activity. For instance, we talk about these receptors the immune system has, but we also look at their working in the bone marrow. And with their work in the bone marrow and their influence on stem cells, for instance, if you have a patient, a dog, let's say, who is undergoing chemotherapy or radiation therapy, one of the things we worry about most of all is that the chemo or the radiation can knock out these stem cells in the bone marrow, which is why we oftentimes will see anemia or a reduction in the white cells in patients who are receiving chemo or radiation. Well, studies show that the mushrooms can help to regenerate these stem cells in the bone marrow. And
Wow.
many studies show that mushrooms do not interfere with radiation therapy and probably are a good supplement to use, also because they will protect the bone marrow from too much loss.
What about the vitamin D aspect?
So the vitamin D piece is very interesting
Mhm.
because there's a molecule in all fungi, even not mushrooms, even just regular fungi, called ergosterol. And
Mhm.
ergosterol is an important molecule in the metabolism of the fungal cell. I think in terms of a part of the chemical mechanisms that build more structure in the fungal cell. And it's so unique to fungi that if you want to check a bag of grain in a shipment to see if it's contaminated with fungi, you will analyze it for ergosterol. But ergosterol as a molecule is almost identical to cholesterol. They sound similar. Ergosterol, cholesterol. Ergo basically means fungal, comes from ergot fungus, which has been around a while, where we get LSD from and other types of active molecules. So the ergosterol, when it's exposed to UV light, cholesterol, when it's exposed to UV light, it's molecularly converts. There's a very fragile bond there that the UV light breaks and changes, and it changes it under the influence of the UV light to the digestible precursor, what is the edible precursor to the formation of vitamin D2 in the body. That's what ergosterol is a precursor to. And vitamin D2 in studies has been shown to be as effective as vitamin D3, but not quite as potent. So it maybe has 70% of the potency of vitamin D3. So you're probably, if you're using vitamin D2, which is the only organic source of vitamin D, then you'll probably need to dose it a little bit higher, maybe about 30% higher to get a comparable dosage. I've spoken with VDI Labs that does a nice vitamin D test. They said that their vitamin D test will also detect vitamin D2. So you can really get an estimate of total vitamin D when you're doing that, and that can help guide you as far as your supplementation. The mushroom itself has, let's say the mushroom itself has a base level of vitamin D2, and it needs to get exposed to the UV light in order for that base level to be expanded. And there was one study done in Maitake where I think they said it had like 4,000 international units per unit weight before UV exposure, and after exposure for several hours, it had like 32,000. When I go to when I buy mushrooms, for instance, and portobello are pretty easy this way because they're so big and flat, and I'll put them outside, cut
Yeah.
them so that they can't get the insects can get them, but expose them to ultraviolet light before I put them in the fridge. And then that way, when I'm cooking them, I'm also getting some vitamin D too. So yeah, I mean, they've got everything. I'm fond of calling them the Swiss Army knife because they just have so many active ingredients and have so many different functions.
Wonderful. Ariel, I know you had a question for Dr. Rob.
Yeah, so when pet parents are looking at mushrooms and they're looking at mushrooms as a daily supplement for their dog, as a lifestyle, like you mentioned, we touched on allergies and we touched on when a dog is going through chemotherapy. So what do pet parents need to know about choosing the right kind of mushrooms for their dogs?
Well, that depending what you're using it for. If you're looking at wellness, or maybe the new word for wellness is longevity, you might look at one type of mushroom or different types of mushrooms for that. If you're looking at addressing, a serious disease like cancer, or maybe a chronic infection like a fungal infection, like maybe coccidioidomycosis or blastomycosis or histomycosis, you want to think about a certain set of mushrooms. And at the same time, if you're looking at more neurologic benefits, in terms of cognition, mentation, we have these senior dogs that wind up getting sundowners, then you might look at different mushrooms. That's why I called the book, there's a mushroom for that, because there are so many applications, so, everyone is, as Livy mentioned, everyone thinks about the turkey tail mushroom, when we think about cancer, but that's only because there was a study, and
Mm.
the study was in dogs. We have very few studies in dogs, but the reality is that many, many mushrooms show this benefit to addressing cancer. And there's many studies that support that. Even the common edible mushroom, button mushroom that grows in such great abundance there near where Livy lives,
Very good.
or the shiitake mushrooms themselves have been shown to have, especially the shiitake, but even the button mushrooms have been shown to have huge benefits for cancer patients. I went to a talk by a researcher from the City of Hope, which is a cancer center out in L.A. He sent his assistants to the supermarket to just buy different vegetables and things. Then he tested them in vitro against cancer cells, and he found that of all the vegetables that they could collect at the supermarket, and mushrooms aren't a vegetable, but we'll categorize them that way, the button mushrooms had the most effectiveness for prostate and breast cancer. So, I mean, simple mushrooms like that. Their epidemiological studies show that in populations of people who eat mushrooms regularly, that they have enhanced longevity. That we see that when they compare the group of people in that population that don't eat mushrooms to those that do, and then you look at all-cause mortality is how they define it, that just eating mushrooms as part of your lifestyle reduces your risk of developing cancer. They've shown that even although we think about lion's mane for mentation and cognition, they've also shown that just eating any mushrooms, one serving of mushroom a week in this one epidemiological study was sufficient to improve mental health parameters. Two servings of mushrooms a week was enough to convert people that already had mental health issues to a more healthier status. So we think about lion's mane for that, and we think about golden oyster as well. Golden oysters, new mushroom on the horizon. We're using Real Mushrooms is cultivating quite a bit of it because it's very, very high in an antioxidant that we've come to recognize as maybe vitamin L, vitamin longevity. It's called ergothioneine. And ergothioneine is a sulfur-based antioxidant, very similar to glutathione, but it has kind of advanced properties. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. And so they've been done copious studies with it that have found that it is also associated with that levels in the body increased cognitive deficits. So by supplementing with ergothioneine, or supplementing with golden oyster, or supplementing with other mushrooms that have ergothioneine in them, like lion's mane has the ergothioneine in it as well as the terpenes, which contributes to its benefit to cognition. I mean, there's so many ingredients in so many different mushrooms.
Yeah. And I know in your book you do share some wonderful stories and some case studies. Do you have a favorite case study of yours that isn't listed in your book that you could tell us about, that where you actually saw a difference? I have a dog right now and he has some form of cancer. They couldn't really put a name on it, but it's a massive growth on his face. And all of the treatments that we were going through, I went through at least 5 different vets, and he just kept getting worse. And I thought, I forgot I was an herbalist and a nutritionist. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start treating him at home. And I started him on a mushroom regime, an herbal regime, etc. And he made pretty drastic improvements. Now, obviously, the cancer did not go away, but he is more stable now. He's more functional, and he seems to be a little more comfortable. So I did share that story when we spoke at a conference, at the Healthy Dog Conference. And I just wanted to share that story with other people because I think it's so beneficial knowing that there are other things that we can supplement in conjunction with Western medicine.
Well, I want to share a story about my own dog, Ollie. And it's a little bit out of the mainstream. Ollie's a rescue dog. He was found at 3 or 4 months of age with a broken leg and dislocated hip. And he's always had PTSD. He's always had a lot of anxiety. Although he's a lab and very much wants to be close to me, he doesn't want to get too close because then he gets nervous. And I later engaged an animal communicator who said that Ollie told her that he had been used by a bunch of like frat boys, and they were throwing him against a wall or something, and broke his leg, and then dumped him out there. So he's got big stuff, and my heart goes out to him. And I know he's towards the end of his life, but I just his behavior problem is just the worst in terms of his quality of life. He just seems so unhappy all the time, most of the time, and we know that behavior problems are one of the main reasons why dogs are relinquished at the Humane Society. So I've been very interested in trying to find solutions. And we've looked at lion's mane, and lion's mane can be very effective for many dogs, especially as they're aging, experiencing cognitive decline. And some dogs who have chronic anxiety types of conditions, generalized anxiety, PTSD, thunderphobia, we found that lion's mane can be part of a protocol as a standalone, probably not good enough. But for instance, in the relaxed mushroom chews, which have lion's mane and reishi in them, I also put tryptophan and theanine because I wanted to create an immediate response in terms of the serotonin release so people could get an immediate response. And now we find that we can actually use this for traveling and things like that. And if you combine that with CBD, you get an even more profound response without getting sedation. But nonetheless, the lion's mane was not sufficient really to help Ollie as I wanted him to. I've become very interested in reading about how much psilocybin assisted therapy seems to be helping a lot of people. Not just the heroic doses of psilocybin, but the micro doses, and I know that there's a little bit of a legal issue, although really not quite as bad as there was with CBD. And I'm in Colorado, which basically has decriminalized it. And I'm working with a fella in California, which has in a similar legal status. And so we've developed a project. We call it the Canine Microdose Project because I want to explore this. I want to explore this and see if maybe this can be a safe solution for many dogs and maybe cats. We'll start with dogs because dogs are a little easier. With many dogs, that could be a benefit. So what better dog to start with than your own? So we started out by giving Ollie a human microdose that this guy makes. And he seemed really unhappy. You could just see it in his eyes. And I engaged this animal communicator to talk to him, and she said, yeah, the dose was too high. So we lowered the dose substantially, at least half, and we gave it to him every other day instead of every day. And it took about 3 or 4 weeks, but I will say that I'm starting to see a conversion in his behavior. I don't know. I'm trying to be cautious about making too many conclusions from this, but I'm very encouraged. We're hoping that we can enlist a number of other people into our project, and I'll give you the link to it so you can put there. I'll give you a bunch of links when we're done. And it's not for everyone, and I'll interview each person about their animal and decide if it's a good fit or not. Some are good fits, some aren't, and I want everything to be under my review. We know we're kind of in a gray zone with some things, so we want to be careful about it. We're using a survey that the University of Pennsylvania has, a behavior survey, and we have an intake interview, and then I'll take a history and do that sort of thing. So we're hopefully get enough individual responses, that we can figure out, does this work? Maybe it doesn't work, but how else, unless I know there's someone who's doing a project with war dogs that have PTSD from that. So I think there is interest. It's happening in a few isolated places, and people probably aren't talking it up too much, just because there are some, gray zones regarding the legal aspect of it.
That sounds like such groundbreaking work. I've never thought about it for a dog. All of my dogs are rescues. They all came with a host of different anxieties, and I have microdosed CBD along with THC, and I haven't really seen any improvements. And I've tried different doses. I spoke to I don't know if I would call him a practitioner, but he recommended a higher dose. And he said, as long as the dog isn't urinating on himself, he's fine. And I thought, I don't know if I agree with that information. I thought there has to be a better way when it comes to microdosing and because each dog is individual. And that's another thing that we could touch on briefly is, so we have a lot of clients that reach out to us and they're saying, well, we have our dog on this protocol because this is what so and so is doing, and so said that this would be great because their dog is thriving on it, but their dog isn't thriving on it. And I think that's another thing that a lot of pet parents are slowly starting to realize is the individuality of each dog.
I think when you're talking CBD, it's even more individual than with mushrooms. And I'm not sure there's really a time and place for microdosing CBD, maybe microdosing THC, because dogs are I think that's what this person was talking about, because if you give them too much THC, they can lose control of their bladder. So he was using that as his parameter, and really it's much better to use an actual mgs per kg dosage that I have developed. And also I have instructions in this same book on mushrooms about the use of THC and CBD in dogs, because many people now live in states where they can walk into a dispensary and buy THC with a 21 or older driver's license, give it to their dog, and send them straight to the ER. Because dogs are more sensitive to THC than any other animal on this planet, and they get a very specific kind of response to it. But yes, it is very individual, and Real Mushrooms gets a lot of questions. Like the largest number of customer service questions we have is about how much to give. At the same time, as Real Mushrooms is getting bigger and bigger as they are, they're also more concerned about making sure they're compliant with FDA language regulations. And FDA does not want you to make medical claims about something that is not a drug. And so this is commonly what's happening in the supplement space, is people are selling supplements to be used instead of drugs. And so, we do a little hand waving. We say, this isn't really a drug, but you have to watch your language as well. And dosage is kind of, at hand with being a drug. So with Real Mushrooms, we're trying to reshape our whole dosing recommendations. And there's been some changes there because we're trying to reduce you want to give this much for that weight of an animal, so what we're doing now is just giving a base dose and then recommending, that for maybe moderate, as the need increases for what the condition is, then you want to give a larger amount. So for wellness, it would be the amount that we put on the label. But if you're talking about moderate need, which might be fermentation, might be for allergies, might be for mobility, we then would maybe double that or triple that amount, and give it twice daily versus once daily. If you're talking about something even more serious like cancer or these nasty fungal infections, then you might even do it, 4 times or 6 times higher. It depends. I tell people with patients with animals that have cancer, I said, really, you're limited only by your dog's tolerance, of the mushrooms and your budget. And we don't really have it worked out as far as how much to do. I don't think you're going to go wrong by giving more, and pet parents are really worried. I don't know who's telling them all this stuff about these interactions, these drug interactions, these interactions with other supplements, with having to develop tolerance, so they have to rotate it. I mean, they're getting a lot of information that really is not valid, very little truth to it. And I don't know if it's because these people that are making themselves sound like experts are telling people stuff that they're making up, or it's what they found was true with one animal, But I go by the information that's published, as well as what has been empirically decided upon by multiple veterinarians, who I believe, being a veterinarian, I'm a little petty. But I think veterinarians are trained to be observers, to be objective observers of their patients. And so I tend to trust the observations of the veterinarian more than someone who's not trained, although certainly many pet parents, I always listen to the pet parent. No matter what they say, no matter how wacky it is that the story is that I get from a pet parent, I always realize there's some grain of truth there that I need to tease out.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that question all the time. I'm always putting our clients on medicinal mushrooms, and we have a lot of cancer clients that have come back to us and said, the vet has pulled our dog off of all the mushroom supplements that you recommended because we're going to be starting chemotherapy, radiation, etc., and that there's going to be drug interactions.
And there's really not many, most drugs. I mean, there's studies that show mushroom use alongside chemotherapy, enhancing the effects of chemotherapy. Mushrooms can enhance the effects of radiotherapy, so it depends, so someone out there is putting the kibosh on stuff. I think it's important to be honest with your veterinarian, but at the same time, there may be a time and place where a little bit of fibbing is not a bad thing. And I'll leave it at that.
But you spoke about your book a lot, and I've got it here. There's a mushroom for that. Where can people find your books so that they can go over all those mushrooms and the cannabis and everything else that you've talked about today?
Well, the best source really is the Amazon link, and I'll share that with you so you can share that with everyone. It's the shipping is the least, the cost is the least. You'll get it the quickest. And I'm using the book, as a reference text and as a working text for some of these live events that I'm starting to do, just as you're starting to do these podcasts. Last week we did a live Q&A out of my website. It was just a Zoom meeting, but we had like 40 people attending live. It was really great. Each live that we're going to do, we're going to cover a different chapter in the book and maybe go back and go over some chapters. We did allergies because it's that seasonal time of the year, and try to figure out what we'll do next month. But that would be the best place for them to get that book. It took me 4 years to write, and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. It's self-published, but I have to say that I'm really proud of it. And the feedback that I get from people is that they really find, pet parents especially, they find it very, very worthwhile with a lot of, actionable information. It's my way. Is what I learned and how I practiced over I now have, I'm a 1982 graduate of vet school. So what's that, like over 40 years of practice? So it's got my stuff. There may be people that differ with my decisions and things like that as far as my choices of supplements or my approaches to things, but it's worked for me, and I'm a very practical practitioner, and I always try to figure out to make things understandable for the pet parents so they can actually get it done.
That's awesome. And I'm so glad that you shared that with the world. And I definitely hope that pet parents take a look at this because it is wonderfully laid out.
Yes, it's a great book. I think that such a labor of love on your part. I think it's really well done. And I love it. I don't have it on me now because I just shared it with my in-laws. Well, thank you for chatting with us. Is there anything else you want to share with us?
Wow. Yeah, I pretty much have touched on a lot of things. I hope this was good for you.
We love just being able to talk organically and let things roll. Thank you again, Dr. Rob. We'll link to your book and resources in the show notes. And to our listeners, thank you for being a part of the Volhard Pack. Be sure to subscribe, and we will catch you next time.